When William Harrison stood on the half-constructed steel framework of what would become the Thames Industrial Complex on that September morning in 1940, watching the formation of 6 Junkers Ju-88 bombers streak across the London sky, leaving contrails of smoke and devastation in their wake, he experienced a moment of terrible clarity that made him drop his blueprint rolls and grip the cold metal beam beside him with white-knuckled intensity, not from fear of the bombing raid that was pounding the city into rubble for the 37th consecutive night, but from the sudden realization that the massive construction project he'd been designing for the past 8 months, a project dismissed by his engineering colleagues as overly ambitious and by military strategists as a waste of critical wartime resources, could be completely reimagined using principles of structural resonance and harmonic dampening to create something that had never existed before, buildings that didn't just survive bombing but actually absorbed and dissipated the explosive force of German bombs through calculated architectural design, transforming Britain's cities from vulnerable targets into resilient fortresses that would make the Luftwaffe's strategic bombing campaign not just ineffective but counterproductive. It was an idea so radical, so technically unprecedented, and so apparently insane that when William finally articulated it 3 days later to a hastily assembled group of skeptical government officials, royal engineers, and exhausted city planners in a makeshift conference room beneath Whitehall, they would dismiss him as a man who had cracked under the psychological strain of the Blitz. But within 4 months, William's crazy idea would fundamentally change how Britain defended itself against aerial bombardment and would save thousands of lives while helping ensure that England would indeed withstand the bombing campaign that Hitler believed would break British resolve and force a negotiated surrender. William Harrison was 38 years old in September 1940, a structural engineer who had made his reputation in the 1930s designing innovative bridge supports and industrial facilities that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with steel and concrete. He'd studied at Cambridge, worked on projects across Europe and North America, and had published several well-regarded papers on load distribution and structural integrity. By any conventional measure, he was a successful professional at the peak of his career, with a comfortable home in Hampstead, a wife and 2 children evacuated to the countryside for safety, and more work than he could handle as Britain's wartime construction boom created enormous demand for engineering expertise. But the Blitz had changed everything. Beginning in early September 1940, German bombers had launched a sustained campaign of night bombing against British cities, particularly London. The raids came every night, sometimes with hundreds of aircraft, dropping high-explosive bombs and incendiaries that destroyed buildings, shattered infrastructure, and killed thousands of civilians. The British population showed remarkable resilience, the famous keep calm and carry on spirit that would define their response to the bombing, but the physical destruction was devastating. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Historic buildings were destroyed. Critical infrastructure was damaged. And there seemed to be no end in sight. William had been assigned to oversee the construction of the Thames Industrial Complex, a massive project that would consolidate several manufacturing facilities critical to the war effort into a single, heavily fortified location on the Thames riverbank. The project had been in planning since before the war began, designed to improve efficiency and coordination of war production. But the Blitz had made the project seem almost pointless. Why build massive new facilities when German bombers could destroy them in a single night? The engineering challenges were substantial. The complex needed to house heavy machinery, provide space for thousands of workers, protect critical equipment, and be built quickly despite material shortages and a workforce depleted by military conscription. William had spent months developing designs that balanced these competing requirements, creating plans for a facility that would be functional, efficient, and as bomb-resistant as current understanding of structural engineering allowed. But standing on that steel framework on September 12, 1940, watching the Ju-88s overhead and feeling the ground shake from bombs falling miles away, William had seen something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of structural engineering. The incomplete steel skeleton of the complex, just the bare bones of what would become a much larger structure, had vibrated in response to the distant explosions. But the vibration pattern wasn't what he would have expected. Instead of the chaotic shaking that should have resulted from random explosive shockwaves, The structure had moved in regular, almost rhythmic patterns, as if the steel framework was resonating at specific frequencies. William's engineering training immediately recognized what he was observing. Every structure has natural frequencies at which it tends to vibrate. These are determined by the structure's size, shape, materials, and how it's supported. Usually, engineers try to prevent structures from vibrating at these natural frequencies because resonance can amplify forces and cause structural failure. But watching the incomplete complex respond to the distant bombing, William had a radical thought. What if you could design structures whose natural frequencies were specifically calculated to resonate with explosive shock waves in ways that dissipated the energy harmlessly rather than allowing it to cause damage? It was a counterintuitive idea. Conventional wisdom said you should make buildings as rigid and strong as possible to resist blast forces. But William was proposing something different. Make buildings that moved with the blast forces in carefully calculated ways, absorbing and redirecting the energy through the structure's deliberate flexibility rather than trying to resist it with brute strength. The concept had parallels in other fields. Musicians knew that strings and columns of air vibrated at specific frequencies that could be controlled by changing their length, tension, or other characteristics. Seismologists understood that earthquakes caused different types of waves that affected structures differently. Even biologists had observed that some animals could absorb impacts through flexible structures rather than rigid ones. Cats that could fall from great heights by distributing the force through their flexible spines, bamboo that survived typhoons by bending rather than breaking. But applying these principles to bomb-resistant architecture was completely unprecedented. William spent the next 3 days frantically calculating, sketching designs, running theoretical models, and trying to work out whether his intuition could be translated into practical engineering. He barely slept, working through the nights as German bombers continued their raids overhead, filling notebook after notebook with calculations and diagrams. The mathematics was fiendishly complex. The explosive force of a bomb creates several different types of shock waves. A primary blast wave that moves at supersonic speed, followed by slower-moving pressure waves, ground shock that travels through the earth, and structural vibrations that can persist for seconds after the initial explosion. Each type of wave has different characteristics, different frequencies, different energies, different propagation patterns. To design a structure that could absorb and dissipate all these different types of energy would require unprecedented precision in structural design. But William believed it was possible. If you could calculate the dominant frequencies of typical German bomb explosions, you could design buildings whose structural elements would resonate at complementary frequencies that would cancel out or redirect the destructive energy. Support columns could be designed to flex in specific patterns. Floor slabs could be engineered to act as massive dampeners. Even the spaces between walls could be calculated to create interference patterns in the pressure waves. On September 15, 1940, William finally had enough confidence in his calculations to present his idea to authorities. He requested an urgent meeting with the Ministry of Home Security, the War Office, and representatives from the Royal Engineers. Getting such a meeting arranged quickly was difficult. Everyone was overwhelmed with the immediate crisis of responding to the nightly bombing raids, but William's reputation as a respected engineer and his insistence that he had a critical proposal related to bomb defense eventually secured him a spot on the agenda. The meeting was held in a reinforced basement beneath Whitehall, one of many underground spaces that had been converted into emergency offices and meeting rooms. William arrived carrying 3 large cases of documents: his calculations, his diagrams, his theoretical models, and his proposed modifications to the Thames industrial complex design that would implement his ideas. The attendees were a mix of military officers, government officials, and technical experts, all of them exhausted, many of them clearly skeptical about what this civilian engineer could possibly propose that would matter in the face of the massive bombing campaign. The chairman of the meeting, a War Office official named Colonel Roberts, got straight to the point. "Mr. Harrison, we've given you 30 minutes because we understand you have some proposal related to bomb defense. I'll be frank, we're desperately busy managing the current crisis, so unless you have something genuinely revolutionary to suggest, we need to move on to more pressing matters. What is it you want to propose?" William stood, opened his first case of documents, and began his presentation. Gentlemen, I'm proposing that we stop trying to build structures that resist bomb blasts and instead build structures that absorb and dissipate blast energy through calculated resonance and harmonic dampening. I believe we can design buildings that are orders of magnitude more resistant to bombing than anything we're currently constructing, using the same materials and at comparable cost. He could see the skepticism on their faces immediately, but he pressed on, pulling out his diagrams and calculations. Every structure has natural frequencies at which it vibrates. Currently, we try to avoid these frequencies because resonance can cause failure. But I'm proposing we embrace resonance, design it deliberately, to create structures that respond to bomb blasts by vibrating in ways that dissipate energy harmlessly. That's absurd, interrupted a royal engineer named Major Phillips. You're suggesting we make buildings deliberately flexible during bombing? That's exactly the opposite of everything we know about structural integrity. With respect, Major, it's exactly what we do with many other engineering challenges, William responded. Suspension bridges are designed to move with wind loads rather than resist them rigidly. Ships' hulls flex with wave forces. Even the Eiffel Tower was designed to sway in wind rather than stand completely rigid. The principle of using flexibility to absorb forces rather than resisting them with rigidity is well established. But not for bomb protection, Phillips persisted. You're talking about massive explosive forces, not gradual environmental loads. The energy levels are completely different. William pulled out more documents. I've calculated the force profiles of typical German bombs, the SC-250 and SC-500 that they're using most frequently. I've analyzed the blast wave characteristics, the pressure profiles, the frequency signatures. And I've designed structural systems that I believe can absorb these specific force profiles through calculated resonance. He spread out his most detailed diagram, showing a building design unlike anything they'd seen before. The support columns weren't uniform, they varied in thickness and spacing in carefully calculated patterns. The floor slabs weren't simple horizontal surfaces but incorporated complex internal structures that would flex in specific ways. Even the exterior walls were designed with multiple layers separated by precisely measured gaps. This looks insane, said Colonel Roberts, studying the diagrams. It looks like something designed by someone who doesn't understand basic structural principles. I understand your reaction, sir, William replied. It violates conventional wisdom about how buildings should be designed. But the calculations support it. More importantly, I've observed partial resonance effects in the incomplete Thames industrial complex that I'm currently overseeing. The bare steel framework is already showing harmonic response to distant explosions. With deliberate design, we could amplify these effects enormously. A civilian engineer from the Ministry of Home Security, a man named Thomas Wright who specialized in blast protection, leaned forward with interest. Mr. Harrison, I'm intrigued by your theoretical work, but the practical challenges seem insurmountable. The precision required to achieve these resonance effects, we'd need to calculate and implement structural elements to tolerances far beyond what's standard in construction. And what happens if the Germans change their bombing tactics or use different weapons? The tolerance requirements are demanding but achievable, William acknowledged. As for adaptability, the beauty of resonance-based design is that structures can be tuned to respond to a range of frequencies, not just one specific wavelength. We design for the dominant blast characteristics we're seeing, but with enough flexibility to handle variations. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, far beyond the 30 minutes originally allocated. William fielded increasingly technical questions about his calculations, his assumptions, his proposed implementation. Some attendees were intrigued, others remained deeply skeptical, but everyone recognized that if the concept had even a chance of working, it could be transformative. Finally, Colonel Roberts called for a decision. Mr. Harrison, your proposal is certainly unconventional. Some would say crazy. But we're in a desperate situation, and desperate times sometimes require desperate measures. I'm willing to authorize a small-scale test of your concepts. You'll modify a portion of the Thames industrial complex according to your designs. We'll subject it to controlled blast testing and see if your theory holds up in practice. If it works, we'll consider wider implementation. If it fails, we move on. Do you accept these terms? Yes, sir, William replied immediately. I'll need access to additional engineering staff, priority for certain materials, and cooperation from the construction teams currently working on the complex. But I can have a test section ready for evaluation within 6 weeks. You have 4 weeks, Roberts countered. The Blitz isn't going to wait for our convenience. 4 weeks to build your test section, then we'll evaluate. Major Phillips, you'll oversee the testing protocols and provide an independent assessment. Mr. Wright, you'll monitor the construction and ensure Mr. Harrison doesn't compromise the overall project's safety. Gentlemen, if there's nothing else, we all have work to do. The next 4 weeks were the most intense of William's professional life. He worked 18-hour days, supervising the construction of the test section while continuing to manage the regular building program for the rest of the complex. The test section was a 3-story structure measuring 40 meters by 30 meters, incorporating all of his resonance-based design principles. Every structural element was precisely calculated and positioned according to his theoretical models. The construction workers thought he was mad. They'd never seen anything like the designs he was implementing: columns that varied in diameter at seemingly random intervals, floor slabs with strange internal geometries, walls with complex layering that served no obvious purpose. But William was respected enough, and the situation desperate enough, that they followed his instructions even when they seemed to make no sense. William also faced skepticism and resistance from the project's other engineers. Several refused to work on the test section, believing the design was fundamentally unsound and dangerous. One senior engineer, a man named George Patterson who had worked with William on previous projects, confronted him directly. "William, I've known you for 10 years. You're a brilliant engineer, one of the best I've worked with. But this design frightens me. You're violating every principle of structural integrity we've ever learned. If those calculations are even slightly wrong, the whole thing could collapse during testing, and it'll be your career and reputation destroyed along with it." "I know the risks, George," William replied. "But I also know the mathematics is sound. Every calculation has been checked and rechecked. The theory is solid. And if this works, if we can actually build structures that survive bombing through harmonic dampening rather than brute resistance, we can save thousands of lives. And if it doesn't work, then I'll have failed and failed publicly. But I have to try. Standing by and watching the Blitz destroy London night after night while I know there might be a better way, I can't do that." The test section was completed on schedule in late October 1940. The structure looked unusual but not obviously unsound. Most of the innovative design elements were internal or subtle enough that casual observers wouldn't immediately recognize how different it was from conventional buildings. But to the engineers who understood what William had attempted, it represented either a breakthrough or a spectacular failure waiting to happen. The test protocol designed by Major Phillips was rigorous and potentially destructive. The section would be subjected to progressively larger explosive charges at measured distances, simulating the blast effects of German bombs from long-range detonations up to near-direct hits. Instrumentation would measure structural response, energy dissipation, and damage patterns. A nearby conventional structure of similar size would be tested simultaneously for comparison. The first test was scheduled for October 28, 1940. A small group of observers gathered at a safe distance: military officials, engineers, construction managers, and representatives from various government ministries. William stood among them, his stomach tight with anxiety. For weeks of brutal work, his reputation, and potentially the lives of thousands of people hung on what would happen in the next few hours. The first explosion was relatively small, simulating a distant bomb blast. The pressure wave hit both structures simultaneously. The conventional building, a solid, traditionally designed structure, absorbed the shock with minimal visible effect, just as expected for such a small charge. William's test section responded differently. The entire structure seemed to shudder, with visible movement in the columns and walls, but the movement was coordinated, almost rhythmic, like a massive musical instrument responding to a note. "Dear God, look at it flex," someone muttered. "It's going to collapse." But it didn't collapse. The movement subsided after several seconds, and when engineers inspected the structure, they found no damage whatsoever. The conventional building also showed no damage at this small charge level, so the first test was inconclusive. Both structures had survived, though Williams had done so in a dramatically different way. The second test used a larger charge, equivalent to a 50-kilogram bomb at moderate distance. This time, the difference between the two structures was more apparent. The conventional building showed some cracking in exterior walls and minor structural stress. Williams' test section again exhibited dramatic flexing and movement, but when the shaking subsided and engineers inspected it, the damage was actually less than the conventional structure had sustained. Major Phillips was studying the instrumentation readings with intense focus. The resonance section is dissipating approximately 40% more energy than the conventional structure, he announced. The flex you're seeing isn't structural weakness, it's controlled movement that's redirecting blast force through the frame. The third test was the critical one, a large charge simulating a 250-kilogram bomb, the workhorse of the German bombing campaign, at a distance that would represent a near miss. This was the scenario that British buildings were facing every night during the Blitz, and it was the scenario where Williams' design either had to prove itself or be abandoned as an interesting failure. The explosion was massive, far larger than the previous tests. The pressure wave was visible as a distortion in the air as it raced toward the two structures. The conventional building took the blast like a boxer taking a punch, rigid, resistant, trying to absorb the force through sheer strength. Significant damage was immediately visible. Walls cracked, windows blew out, one corner of the structure sagged as support members bent. Williams' test section responded in its now characteristic way. The entire structure seemed to move as a coordinated unit, flexing and swaying in patterns that looked alarming but were actually exactly what William had designed for. The building absorbed the blast wave like a shock absorber, dissipating the energy through calculated structural movement rather than trying to resist it through rigidity. When the dust settled and engineers cautiously approached both structures, the results were stunning. The conventional building had sustained major damage. It was still standing but would need substantial repairs. Williams' test section had superficial damage but was fundamentally intact. More importantly, the interior spaces of Williams' building were in far better condition. While the conventional structure's interior had been devastated by the pressure wave that penetrated through cracked walls and blown-out windows, the test section's interior had remained relatively protected. "This is extraordinary," Major Phillips said, reviewing the instrumentation data. The resonance design dissipated approximately 60% of the blast energy that reached the structure. The conventional building tried to resist the blast and was damaged. Your building absorbed the blast and dispersed it harmlessly. Colonel Roberts, who had been watching the tests with increasing amazement, approached William. "Mr. Harrison, I owe you an apology. When you first presented this idea, I thought you were proposing something between wishful thinking and outright lunacy. But this works. It actually works. We need to run more tests with different charge sizes and different distances," William cautioned, trying to manage his own excitement. "We need to verify that the design principles scale appropriately and work under various conditions. But yes, sir, the fundamental concept appears to be sound. How quickly can we start implementing this in actual defensive construction?" Roberts asked. "Can we retrofit existing buildings? Can we incorporate these principles into new construction?" "Retrofitting would be extremely difficult," William admitted. "The resonance characteristics depend on precise structural relationships that can't easily be added to existing buildings. But for new construction, yes, we can implement immediately. I'll need to train other engineers in the design principles, develop standardized calculations and specifications, and work out production systems for the specialized structural elements." Over the following weeks, William worked with a rapidly expanding team to translate his experimental success into practical implementation. The results of the Thames test section were classified but were shared with key decision-makers across the British government and military. The response was enthusiastic. Here, finally, was something that might shift the balance in the defensive struggle against the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign. William developed what he called the Harmonic Defense Architecture, or HDA system, a set of design principles, calculations, and specifications that other engineers could use to create resonance-based bomb-resistant structures. The system was complex but learnable, and William trained dozens of engineers in the methodology. Priority was given to critical facilities, munitions factories, aircraft production plants, military installations, and key infrastructure. The first full-scale implementation of HDA principles was an aircraft engine factory in Birmingham, a city that had suffered terribly during the Blitz. William supervised the design personally, creating a facility that incorporated every lesson learned from the Thames test section. The building was completed in December 1940, just in time for a renewed German bombing campaign against industrial targets. On December 11, 1940, German bombers hit Birmingham with one of the heaviest raids the city had experienced. Several large bombs fell near the new aircraft engine factory, including one 500-kilogram bomb that detonated less than 50 meters from the building, close enough that conventional structures in the area were severely damaged or destroyed. William received the report the following morning. The HDA-designed factory had sustained minor damage but remained fully operational. More significantly, production had never stopped. Even during the bombing raid, workers inside the building had continued their shifts, protected by a structure that absorbed and dissipated explosive forces that would have devastated a conventional building. The success at Birmingham broke open the floodgates. Suddenly, every construction project in Britain wanted to incorporate HDA principles. William found himself leading a rapidly growing organization, the Harmonic Defense Architecture Bureau, that was responsible for designing and overseeing the construction of bomb-resistant structures across the country. But the work came with tremendous pressure. Lives depended on getting the calculations right. William lived in constant fear that he'd made an error in his mathematics, that some flaw in the theory would reveal itself catastrophically when a building full of workers was hit by a bomb. He worked himself to exhaustion, personally reviewing every design, checking every calculation, visiting every major construction site. His wife Margaret, who had returned to London from the countryside despite the ongoing bombing, worried about him constantly. "You're going to kill yourself from overwork," she told him one evening in January 1941, finding him at his desk at midnight, surrounded by papers and calculations. "If I don't do this work, the Germans will kill thousands of others," William replied, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "Every day we delay implementing HDA on critical facilities is another day those facilities are vulnerable to bombing. I can't slow down." "You're one man, William. You can't personally save everyone in Britain." "No, but I can try to ensure that the buildings protecting them are designed as well as possible. That has to be enough." As 1941 progressed and more HDA-designed structures were completed, a pattern emerged in the bombing damage reports. Buildings incorporating William's resonance principles consistently outperformed conventional structures when subjected to bombing. The improvement wasn't marginal, it was dramatic. HDA buildings were surviving direct hits that would have destroyed conventional structures. More importantly, the interiors of HDA buildings remained habitable and functional even after severe attacks, whereas conventional buildings often became unusable even from near misses. The German Luftwaffe noticed the change. Intelligence reports indicated that German bombers were being diverted from certain targets because previous raids had proven ineffective. The Ju-88 bombers that had been so devastating in the early months of the Blitz were finding their attacks less successful against the newer British industrial facilities. German intelligence couldn't figure out what had changed. The buildings didn't look dramatically different from the outside, and the principle of harmonic dampening was so counterintuitive that German engineers didn't seriously consider it even when British defectors and spies hinted at something unusual about British construction. By mid-1941, the Blitz was winding down. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June redirected Luftwaffe resources eastward, and the sustained bombing campaign against Britain largely ended. But the impact of William's innovation continued. Every HD-designed structure built during the war proved extraordinarily resilient not just to bombing but to other challenges. Fires spread more slowly through the structure's segmented designs, structural failures from other causes were rare, and the buildings proved remarkably adaptable to changing needs. After the war, when researchers analyzed the effectiveness of Britain's defense against the Blitz, William Harrison's contribution was recognized as having been more significant than most people realized. While the heroism of fighter pilots in the Battle of Britain received enormous public attention, and the resilience of the British civilian population was rightly celebrated, the technical innovation that had made critical facilities genuinely bomb-resistant had played a crucial but largely invisible role in ensuring Britain's survival and eventual victory. William himself remained characteristically modest about his achievement. In a lecture he gave to engineering students at Cambridge in 1947, he reflected on the experience. "The idea of harmonic defense architecture wasn't really mine. It was a synthesis of principles that were already known but had never been applied to this particular problem. Musicians understood resonance. Seismologists understood wave propagation. Structural engineers understood flexible versus rigid design. I just connected these existing ideas in a new way because I happened to be standing on a steel framework watching bombers overhead at exactly the right moment to make those connections. What I learned from this experience," William continued, "is that innovation often comes from seeing familiar things from unfamiliar angles. The principle of using flexibility to absorb forces rather than resisting them with rigidity wasn't new, but applying it to bomb defense was revolutionary because everyone was so focused on making buildings stronger that they never considered making them smarter. Sometimes the best solution to a problem isn't doing the obvious thing better, but doing something completely different that seems crazy until it works." William Harrison lived to see his harmonic defense principles influence architecture and engineering far beyond their original purpose. The same principles that made buildings resistant to bombs proved useful for earthquake resistance, for managing wind loads on tall structures, for creating buildings that could adapt to environmental stresses. William's crazy idea, conceived during the desperate days of the Blitz, became a fundamental principle of modern structural engineering. When William died in 1968 at the age of 66, his obituary in the Times described him as the engineer whose innovative thinking during Britain's darkest hour helped ensure that England could withstand the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign and remain in the war. But the full story of how a man standing on an incomplete structure, watching bombers overhead, had intuited a revolutionary approach to bomb defense, an approach so counterintuitive that it seemed insane until proven successful, remained largely unknown outside engineering circles. The Thames Industrial Complex, the site where William had first conceived his harmonic defense ideas, continued operating for decades after the war. The test section that had proven the concept was preserved as part of the complex, and in 1985, it was designated as a historic landmark, one of the few structures commemorated not for what happened there but for what it represented. A moment when someone looked at a terrifying problem and imagined a solution that everyone else had missed. Today, engineers studying the Blitz and Britain's defensive responses recognize that the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign failed for many reasons: the resilience of the British people, the effectiveness of fighter defense, the determination of civil defense workers, the difficulties of accurate bombing with the technology available. But among those factors, the increasing difficulty of destroying critical facilities as HDA principles were implemented played a larger role than most histories acknowledge. William Harrison's crazy idea that buildings should absorb and dissipate blast energy through calculated structural resonance rather than trying to resist it through brute strength had seemed absurd when he first proposed it in September 1940. But by the time the Blitz ended, that idea had become reality in hundreds of structures across Britain, had saved countless lives, had protected critical war production, and had demonstrated that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions are the ones that make everyone think you've lost your mind right up until the moment they work. But the story of harmonic defense architecture was far more complex and fraught than the official accounts suggested. What the public never learned, what even most military historians wouldn't discover until classified documents were released decades later, was that William's innovation had triggered a cascade of consequences he'd never anticipated: political battles within the British government, a German intelligence operation specifically designed to counter HDA structures, a catastrophic failure that nearly ended the entire program, and a personal crisis that would force William to confront the moral weight of being responsible for technology that thousands of people depended on for their survival. The first warning sign came in February 1941, just as HDA implementation was accelerating across Britain. William received a late-night summons to a meeting at the War Office, unusual both for its timing and for the fact that he was given no information about the meeting's purpose. When he arrived at the designated office, he found Colonel Roberts waiting along with two men William had never met, one introduced as Mr. Davies from the Ministry of Economic Warfare, the other, a civilian named Dr. Fisher who spoke English with a slight German accent and whose presence was not explained. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming on such short notice," Roberts began. "We have a situation that requires your immediate attention and absolute discretion. Dr. Fisher, would you explain?" The man with the German accent stood, pulling out a folder of documents. "Mr. Harrison, I am Hans Fischer, a physicist who worked in Germany until 1938, when I emigrated to Britain for political reasons. Before I left Germany, I worked with several colleagues on problems related to structural acoustics and vibration analysis. 3 weeks ago, British intelligence intercepted German military communications that referenced something called Project Gegenschwingung, Project Counter-Resonance. The terminology and the technical details in these communications strongly suggest that German scientists have become aware of your harmonic defense principles and are developing countermeasures." William felt his stomach drop. "How?" "HDA is classified. The principles aren't public knowledge." "We don't know exactly how they learned of it," Davies from Economic Warfare interjected. "But the Germans have an extensive intelligence network, and they've been analyzing bombing damage patterns systematically. It's possible they noticed that certain newer British facilities were surviving attacks better than expected and initiated investigations. Or we may have a security leak somewhere in the construction or engineering network. Regardless of how they learned, the fact is they know, and they're developing responses." Dr. Fisher continued. "Based on the intercepted communications, which are highly technical, the Germans appear to be developing modified bomb fuses and explosive compositions specifically designed to generate blast waves at frequencies calculated to overcome harmonic dampening. If they succeed, your HDA structures could become more vulnerable than conventional buildings. The very features that make them resistant to standard bombs could make them catastrophically vulnerable to specifically tuned explosives." William's mind raced through the implications. His design worked by having structures resonate at frequencies that dissipated blast energy. But if an explosion was specifically engineered to match the structure's vulnerable frequencies, the frequencies that would amplify rather than dampen the destructive force, the results could be devastating. "How far along are they in developing these counter-resonance weapons?" William asked. "We estimate they're at least 2 months away from practical implementation," Davies replied. "But that's only an estimate. They could have a working prototype sooner, or it could take longer. The technical challenges are significant. They have to be able to predict the resonance characteristics of structures they haven't directly examined, then design explosives that can generate the correct frequency profiles. It's not trivial work. Neither was designing the HDA system in the first place," William pointed out. "If they have competent physicists and engineers working on this, they'll solve it eventually. What do you want from me?" Colonel Roberts leaned forward. "We need you to stay ahead of them. You understand the harmonic principles better than anyone. You need to develop countermeasures to their countermeasures, design modifications to HDA structures that will make them resistant to frequency-tuned explosives, or create new design principles that don't have the same vulnerabilities, while simultaneously continuing to implement the current HDA system across Britain and training engineers to use it," Davies added. "We can't afford to stop the program while you develop improvements. The existing HDA structures are still far superior to conventional buildings against standard German bombs." William was silent for a long moment, processing the impossible situation. "You're asking me to fight an engineering battle against German physicists I can't see, whose specific approaches I don't know, while continuing to deploy a system that might become obsolete or even dangerous if they succeed first. And all of this while maintaining absolute secrecy so we don't alert the Germans to how much we know about their counter-resonance project." "Yes," Roberts said simply. "That's exactly what we're asking. Can you do it?" "I don't know if anyone can do it," William admitted. "But I'll try." I'll need access to Dr. Fischer and his knowledge of German scientific capabilities. I'll need the most recent intelligence on their counter-resonance project. And I'll need at least 3 additional senior engineers who can be read into this problem and who have the mathematical sophistication to work on advanced harmonic theory. Over the following weeks, William assembled a small, highly classified team to work on what was codenamed Operation Overtone. The team included Dr. Fischer, 2 Cambridge physicists who had been working on acoustic warfare problems, and 3 structural engineers who William trusted completely. They worked in a secured facility in a nondescript building in Wimbledon, surrounded by calculations, models, and increasingly desperate attempts to anticipate how German counter-resonance weapons might function and how to protect against them. The technical challenge was extraordinarily difficult. Harmonic dampening worked by having structures respond to explosions at frequencies that dissipated energy. But any resonance system has both beneficial frequencies that dampen energy and destructive frequencies that amplify it. William's original HDA designs had been calculated to ensure that the frequencies generated by standard German explosives fell into the dampening range. But if the Germans could engineer explosives that generated frequencies in the amplification range, HDA buildings would tear themselves apart. The fundamental problem, Dr. Fischer explained during one of their planning sessions, is that you've created structures with very pronounced frequency response characteristics. This makes them excellent at dampening standard explosives, but it also makes them potentially vulnerable to specifically tuned attacks. What you need is a design that responds more broadly across a range of frequencies, without the sharp peaks and valleys in the response curve. But that would make the structures less effective against standard bombs, one of the physicists pointed out. We'd be sacrificing proven capability against a potential future threat. Unless we can design a hybrid approach, William said, an idea forming. What if we create structures that have 2 different resonance systems operating simultaneously? One optimized for standard bombs, one designed to dampen the frequencies we predict the Germans might use in counter-resonance weapons. The systems would be partially independent, so even if one is compromised, the other continues to provide protection. The team spent the next month developing what they called dual-mode harmonic dampening, structures that incorporated 2 overlapping but distinct resonance systems. The design was even more complex than the original HDA, requiring extraordinary precision in construction and significantly more expensive to build. But if it worked, it would provide protection against both standard and frequency-tuned explosives. Testing the dual-mode design required building yet another experimental structure and subjecting it to a range of explosive tests, including some where they attempted to replicate what German counter-resonance weapons might produce. The results were encouraging but not perfect. The dual-mode structure was more resistant to frequency-tuned attacks than standard HDA, but it wasn't invulnerable. A sufficiently sophisticated counter-resonance weapon could still cause significant damage. While William and his team worked frantically on defensive innovations, the broader HDA implementation program continued. By mid-1941, over 200 structures across Britain incorporated harmonic defense principles, with dozens more under construction. The system had achieved remarkable success. Documented cases of HDA structures surviving bombing attacks that destroyed nearby conventional buildings were accumulating. But the success created its own problems. The British construction industry was straining under the demands of HDA implementation. The specialized structural elements required for harmonic dampening needed to be manufactured to tolerances far tighter than standard construction, which meant specialized facilities and skilled labor were at a premium. Engineers qualified to design HDA structures were in desperately short supply, despite Williams' training efforts. And the materials required, particularly certain steel alloys that had optimal acoustic properties, were needed for dozens of other war priorities. Political tensions within the British government also began to emerge. Some officials argued that HDA was consuming resources that should go to offensive weapons production or to other defensive priorities like fighter aircraft. Others questioned whether the entire program was worth the investment, particularly given the classified intelligence suggesting the Germans were developing countermeasures. William found himself spending less time on engineering and more time on political management, attending meetings with skeptical government ministers, preparing reports justifying resource allocations, defending the program against critics who wanted to redirect its funding elsewhere. It was exhausting and frustrating work that took him away from the technical problems he was better equipped to solve. The crisis came in July 1941. A new aircraft production facility in Coventry, one of the most sophisticated HDA structures yet constructed, was hit by a German bombing raid. Intelligence had suggested the raid might involve testing of German counter-resonance weapons, so special observation teams were positioned to document the attack and its effects. What happened was William's worst nightmare realized. The German bombers dropped a new type of weapon, a modified explosive device that witnesses later described as producing an unusual, almost musical tone as it fell. When the bombs detonated around the Coventry facility, the HDA structure didn't respond with the controlled, energy-dissipating resonance that William had designed for. Instead, the building went into catastrophic resonant oscillation, with structural elements amplifying rather than dampening the explosive energy. The building didn't completely collapse, but it was severely damaged, far worse than a conventional structure would have been under the same attack. Worse still, the violent oscillations had caused secondary failures throughout the structure. Support columns had fractured, floor slabs had cracked, and portions of the building had become dangerously unstable. Miraculously, casualties were light because the bombing had occurred during a shift change when few workers were inside. But the implications were devastating. The Germans had successfully developed and deployed counter-resonance weapons, and HDA structures were indeed vulnerable to them in exactly the catastrophic way that William and his team had feared. The political firestorm was immediate. Critics of the HDA program demanded its immediate termination, arguing that William had created structures that were now liabilities rather than assets. There were calls for investigations, for accountability, for someone to take responsibility for the disaster. Several newspapers, which had been given selective information about the incident, ran articles questioning the competence of the engineers involved in bomb defense. William was summoned to an emergency meeting of the War Cabinet's Defense Committee, a body that included Churchill himself along with senior military commanders and government ministers. Walking into that meeting, knowing he would have to defend his program in front of Britain's highest leadership while German counter-resonance weapons were proving his critics right, was one of the most daunting moments of William's life. Churchill opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Mr. Harrison, I'm told that the Germans have found a way to turn your clever harmonic buildings into death traps. I'm told that we've invested enormous resources into a system that is now worse than useless. Tell me why I shouldn't order an immediate halt to all HDA construction and investigation of everyone involved in this failure." William stood, his hands shaking slightly but his voice steady. "Prime Minister, with respect, the Coventry incident was not a failure of the HDA program. It was an inevitable development in an ongoing technological contest between British defense and German offense. The Germans developed a countermeasure to our initial harmonic defense approach. This doesn't mean harmonic defense is useless. It means we need to implement our already developed countermeasures to their countermeasures. And how long will it take before they develop countermeasures to those?" challenged a general William didn't recognize. "Are we going to spend this entire war in an endless cycle of escalation, consuming resources we can't afford to waste?" "Possibly," William admitted. "But that's the nature of warfare. Both sides continually try to overcome the other's innovations. The relevant question isn't whether the Germans can develop responses to HDA, but whether the overall investment in harmonic defense provides value compared to alternatives." He pulled out documents he'd prepared, knowing this confrontation was coming. "Let me give you numbers. Since HDA implementation began, approximately 200 structures using harmonic principles have been subjected to German bombing. Of those, 197 survived with minor to moderate damage. 2 were destroyed, including the Coventry facility. 1 suffered major damage but remained standing. In comparison, conventional structures of similar importance subjected to comparable bombing raids have a survival rate of approximately 40%. Even accounting for the Coventry disaster, HDA structures have a 98% survival rate against bombing, compared to 40% for conventional construction. The German counter-resonance weapons are sophisticated and dangerous, but they're also rare and expensive to produce. Most German bombing still uses standard explosives, against which H-Day continues to be highly effective. Churchill studied William for a long moment. You've been working on countermeasures to these German weapons, I'm told. How confident are you that these countermeasures will work? Reasonably confident, sir. The dual-mode harmonic design we've developed should be significantly more resistant to frequency-tuned explosives while maintaining good performance against standard bombs. But I won't claim it's perfect or invulnerable. The Germans have talented scientists and engineers. This is an ongoing competition, not a problem with a permanent solution. Minister Benson, Churchill turned to one of the civilian officials present. What's the resource cost of transitioning to this dual-mode design? Benson consulted his notes. Approximately 15% more expensive than standard H-Day, significantly more complex to construct, requires additional specialized engineering oversight. If we commit to dual mode for all future construction, we'll need to reduce the number of new HDA projects by roughly 20% to stay within resource allocations. Do it, Churchill decided. We transition to this dual mode design immediately. All new HDA construction uses the upgraded system. Existing HDA structures that are particularly vulnerable or particularly critical get retrofitted where feasible. And Mr. Harrison, you and your team continue working on next-generation improvements, because I guarantee the Germans won't stop trying to overcome whatever we implement. He paused, fixing William with the intense gaze that had intimidated far more senior officials. But understand this, Mr. Harrison, you've been given enormous trust and enormous resources. The next time a supposedly harmonic-resistant building fails catastrophically, the consequences won't be another emergency meeting. They'll be the end of your program, your career, and possibly your freedom. The stakes are too high for anything less than success. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, sir, William replied, his throat dry. The meeting ended, and William left with mixed feelings. His program had survived, but barely, and only because the statistical case for H-Day remained strong despite the Coventry disaster. But Churchill's warning had been deadly serious. William was now personally responsible for ensuring that no more HDA structures failed catastrophically, and he had to accomplish this while simultaneously rolling out an upgraded design, continuing to manage the existing program, and staying ahead of German countermeasures. The pressure was crushing. William began experiencing stress-related health problems, severe headaches, insomnia, digestive issues. His wife Margaret, watching him deteriorate under the strain, finally confronted him in August 1941. "You're killing yourself for this program," she said. "You're not sleeping, you're barely eating, you're working yourself to exhaustion. William, no program is worth your life." "It's not about the program," William tried to explain. "It's about the thousands of workers in those buildings, depending on my calculations to keep them safe. It's about the pilots and engineers and factory workers who are in H-Day structures right now, vulnerable to German counter-resonance weapons if I get the next design iteration wrong. I can't stop working because stopping means people die." "People die regardless," Margaret said gently. "This is a war. You're not responsible for every casualty, every setback, every failure. You've done remarkable work that's saved many lives. But you're a human being with limitations, and you need to accept that you can't personally prevent every tragedy." "I can try," William said stubbornly. "And what happens when you collapse from exhaustion?" Margaret challenged. "What happens when the stress causes a heart attack or a breakdown? Who leads the H-Day program then? You're so focused on responsibility to others that you're neglecting your responsibility to yourself and to the people who actually depend on you remaining functional." The conversation haunted William over the following weeks. He knew Margaret was right, he was pushing himself unsustainably hard, and it was affecting both his health and his judgment. But he couldn't see a way to reduce the workload. The dual-mode HDA system needed to be implemented across Britain. The engineering training program needed to continue. The research into next-generation improvements had to proceed. German countermeasure efforts had to be monitored and countered. All of these were genuinely critical tasks, and there weren't enough qualified people to handle them all. The solution, when it came, was suggested by Colonel Roberts during one of their regular coordination meetings. "William, you've been trying to do everything yourself: design work, quality control, training, research, political management. You need to start delegating more aggressively. You're the architect of the HDA system, and you're brilliant at the theoretical work. But you don't need to personally oversee every construction site or train every engineer. You need deputies, people you trust to handle operational details while you focus on the strategic challenges." "I've tried delegating," William protested, "but I need to verify that the work is being done correctly. One miscalculation, one construction error, one failure to implement specifications properly, and people die." "Yes, and if you collapse from overwork, people also die because the program loses its key innovator," Roberts countered. "You need to make a choice: maintain personal control over everything and burn out within months, or build an organization that can function without your constant oversight. The second option is the only one that ensures the HDA program survives long-term." William knew Roberts was right. Over the following months, he worked to build what eventually became the Harmonic Defense Architecture Bureau into a genuine organization rather than a one-man operation that happened to have support staff. He identified talented engineers who could lead regional implementation efforts. He developed standardized training materials that other instructors could use. He created quality control procedures that didn't require his personal inspection of every site. And crucially, he promoted Dr. Fisher and several other team members to leadership positions where they could make technical decisions without requiring William's approval. The delegation was difficult emotionally. William had to accept that other people would make decisions differently than he would, that mistakes would happen, that he couldn't control every detail. But paradoxically, as he gave up some control, the overall program became stronger. Regional implementation teams developed local expertise and could respond to problems faster than waiting for William's direction. The quality control procedures, while not perfect, caught most major errors and actually reduced the burden on William to personally verify everything. And the research team working on next-generation harmonic defense made faster progress when they weren't constantly waiting for William's input. By late 1941, the dual-mode HDA system was being implemented widely across Britain, and the results were encouraging. Several dual-mode structures had been subjected to bombing raids that intelligence suggested included German counter-resonance weapons, and all had performed well, sustaining damage but remaining functional, which was exactly what the design was intended to achieve. The catastrophic failure mode that had destroyed the Coventry facility didn't recur. The German counter-resonance weapon program appeared to stall in early 1942. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were having manufacturing problems with the specialized fuses and explosive compositions required for frequency-tuned weapons. More significantly, the invasion of the Soviet Union had redirected German resources and attention eastward, and the sustained bombing campaign against Britain had largely ended. The weapons that had required such sophisticated defense were being used less frequently against British targets. William found himself in the strange position of having solved a problem that was no longer as acute as it had been. HDA structures continued to provide excellent protection against the occasional German bombing raids that still occurred, and the industrial facilities incorporating harmonic defense principles proved valuable for other reasons. They were more resistant to accidental explosions, fires, and other industrial hazards. But the existential threat of sustained German bombing, which had driven the initial HDA development, had passed. In 1943, as the war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies and thoughts turned to eventual reconstruction, William began working on a new challenge: adapting harmonic defense principles for peacetime construction. The same structural approaches that made buildings resistant to bombing also made them resistant to earthquakes, high winds, and other natural disasters. The mathematical frameworks William had developed for calculating resonance and energy dissipation could be applied to many structural engineering challenges beyond warfare. This work took William in unexpected directions. He collaborated with seismologists in California, with wind engineering experts in the Netherlands, with architects interested in dynamic structures that responded to environmental forces. The principles he developed under the pressure of wartime necessity evolved into a broader structural philosophy that would influence architecture for decades. But William never forgot the human cost of his innovations, both the lives saved by H-Day structures and the lives lost in places like Coventry when German counter-resonance weapons had briefly overcome his designs. In 1945, after the war in Europe ended, William arranged to visit the rebuilt Coventry aircraft facility. He walked through the structure, now incorporating the latest harmonic defense principles, and placed a memorial plaque honoring the workers who had died in the 1941 catastrophic failure. This building stands as a reminder. The plaque read, that innovation is a continuing contest, that no solution is perfect or final, and that engineers bear responsibility for both the successes and failures of their designs. May those who work here know that their safety was purchased with hard-won knowledge and never take for granted the calculations that protect them. The Coventry Memorial became a tradition William maintained throughout his later career. Whenever one of his designs failed, and there were several other failures over the years, though none as catastrophic as Coventry, William would visit the site, document what had gone wrong, and ensure that lessons learned were incorporated into future designs. It was his way of maintaining connection to the human consequences of his work, of never allowing himself to treat engineering as purely an abstract exercise in mathematics and physics. In 1952, William was invited to give a series of lectures at MIT in the United States, speaking about harmonic defense architecture and its evolution into broader applications. During one lecture, a student asked him what he considered his greatest achievement. William thought carefully before answering. Most people would probably say it was developing H-Day during the Blitz, and that certainly had significant impact. But I think my greatest achievement was learning to build an organization that could survive my inevitable mistakes. The first version of H-Day was vulnerable to German counter-resonance weapons in ways I hadn't anticipated. If I'd been working alone, that failure might have ended the entire program. But because I'd built a team, because we had institutional knowledge and capability beyond just my individual insights, we were able to adapt and continue. He paused, looking at the students. Innovation isn't a solitary genius having a brilliant idea. It's building systems that can learn from failures, adapt to challenges, and continue functioning even when the original innovator is wrong or overwhelmed or simply human and fallible. That's what made the H-Day program work in the long run. Not my initial insight about harmonic dampening, but the organization we built that could refine, improve, and defend that insight against both technical and political challenges. William Harrison's legacy extended far beyond the specific structures built using his harmonic defense principles. His approach to innovation, combining theoretical brilliance with organizational building, accepting that no solution was perfect, and maintaining focus on the human consequences of engineering decisions, influenced generations of engineers and architects. The buildings he designed during the Blitz stood for decades, many surviving into the 21st century as museums or repurposed structures, physical reminders that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the ones everyone thinks are crazy right up until they save thousands of lives and change entire industries forever. But there was one chapter of William's story that remained classified for nearly 50 years after the war, known only to a handful of government officials and the small team who had worked on what was codenamed Project Resonance Echo. It was a chapter that would raise profound ethical questions about the dual-use nature of defensive technology and about William's own role in pushing the boundaries of what harmonic principles could accomplish. In March 1944, with Allied invasion of Europe imminent, British intelligence approached William with a disturbing request. They had analyzed German defensive preparations along the French coast and identified a critical vulnerability. Many German fortifications, particularly the massive concrete bunkers that housed artillery positions, had been constructed with structural characteristics that made them potentially susceptible to harmonic attack. What if the same principles William had developed to protect British buildings from German bombs could be reversed, used not to dissipate explosive energy but to amplify it in ways that could destroy heavily fortified positions that conventional explosives couldn't penetrate? The proposal came in a late-night meeting in the same secure facility where William had first been told about German counter-resonance weapons. Colonel Roberts was there again, along with several new faces, a demolitions expert from the Royal Engineers, two physicists William recognized from weapons development programs, and a grim-faced intelligence officer who introduced himself only as Major Stevens. Mr. Harrison, what we're about to discuss is classified at the highest level, Major Stevens began. The information leaves this room under no circumstances. The Prime Minister himself has authorized this inquiry, but very few others even know we're having this conversation. William felt a knot forming in his stomach. What kind of inquiry? We want to know if your harmonic defense principles can be weaponized, Roberts said bluntly. Can they be used not to protect our buildings but to destroy German fortifications? William was silent for a long moment, his engineer's mind immediately seeing the theoretical possibility even as his moral intuition recoiled from the implications. You're asking if we can create weapons that use structural resonance to amplify explosive effects rather than dampening them. Precisely, the demolitions expert confirmed. We have intelligence about German bunker construction specifications. Some of these fortifications are designed to withstand direct hits from battleship guns. Conventional explosives barely scratch them. But if we could trigger resonance in their structural elements, use their own mass and rigidity against them, you could theoretically tear them apart from the inside, William finished the thought. The same principles that make harmonic dampening work, matching frequency characteristics to structural response, would work in reverse. Instead of designing structures to dissipate energy, you design weapons to generate frequencies that amplify destructive resonance in target structures. Can it be done? Major Stevens asked directly. And if so, how quickly could we develop operational weapons for use in the invasion? William stood and walked to a window, looking out at the darkened London streets. The question wasn't whether it could be done. He was already running calculations in his mind, seeing how it could work, identifying the theoretical challenges and practical requirements. The question was whether it should be done, and whether he should be the one to do it. I need to understand the full context, William said finally. You're asking me to develop weapons. I've spent the past 4 years developing defensive systems, saving lives, protecting people. Now you want me to design weapons that will kill people, even if they're enemy soldiers in fortifications. That's a fundamentally different moral territory. Those fortifications will be firing on British and American soldiers during the invasion, Roberts pointed out. Every German artillery position we can neutralize quickly means fewer Allied casualties on the beaches. The invasion's success may depend on rapidly eliminating German strongpoints that conventional weapons can't destroy fast enough. And after the invasion? William challenged. After we've demonstrated that harmonic resonance can be weaponized? What happens when that knowledge spreads? Do we want to live in a world where every building is potentially vulnerable to precisely tuned demolition charges? Where the same principles that protect structures can be turned against them? Major Stevens leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, that world already exists. The Germans are already working on weaponizing harmonics. Their counter-resonance bombs were just the beginning. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're developing demolition charges designed to exploit structural frequencies. If we don't develop this capability ourselves, we'll be defensively vulnerable while they have an offensive weapon we don't understand well enough to counter. It was the same argument that had driven weapons development throughout human history. If we don't develop this, our enemies will, and will be at a disadvantage. William had heard variations of it countless times during the war. Sometimes it was a reasonable argument. Sometimes it was a rationalization for crossing ethical lines that shouldn't be crossed. I need 3 days to think about this, William said. To consult with people I trust. To consider the implications. I won't make this decision tonight. You have 2 days, Stevens replied. The invasion timeline doesn't wait for philosophical deliberation. 2 days, then we need your answer, and if your answer is no, we'll find someone else to work on this program. William spent those 2 days in intense internal debate. He consulted with Dr. Fischer, whose perspective as someone who had fled Nazi Germany gave him a particular moral authority on questions about weapons development. He talked with Margaret, who had always been his moral compass. He even reached out to his former Cambridge advisor, Professor Thompson, now retired but still sharp, to discuss the ethics of dual-use technology. Dr. Fisher's view was pragmatic. The knowledge exists now. You cannot uninvent harmonic principles any more than physicists can uninvent nuclear fission. The question is not whether this knowledge will be weaponized, it will be by someone, somewhere. The question is whether it will be weaponized carefully, with moral guardrails, by people who understand the risks, or whether it will be developed by those who see only its destructive potential. Margaret was more troubled. You've spent years building things that protect people. I worry about what it will do to you, emotionally and morally, to spend your time now designing weapons to destroy things and kill people, even enemy soldiers. I know you, William. You'll carry every death that results from weapons you design. Can you live with that? Professor Thompson offered a historical perspective. Every major advance in structural engineering has eventually been weaponized. Bridges, tunnels, dams, all designed initially for peaceful purposes, all eventually targeted or used in warfare. Your harmonic principles are no different. But history also shows that those who refuse to develop weapons out of moral principle often just ensure those weapons are developed by those with fewer scruples. In the end, William made his decision based on a calculation that was more emotional than rational. He agreed to work on Project Resonance Echo, but with conditions. He would help develop the theoretical framework and design principles for harmonic weapons, but he would not design specific weapons for specific targets. He would work to ensure that any weapons developed included technical limitations that would make them difficult to use against civilian structures. And he insisted on a personal role in developing defensive countermeasures against harmonic weapons, ensuring that the same knowledge being weaponized was also being used to protect against those weapons. The work on Project Resonance Echo consumed much of 1944, running parallel to William's ongoing HDA defensive work. The team was small, just William, Dr. Fisher, 2 explosives experts, and a mathematician who specialized in wave mechanics. They worked in complete isolation, their findings documented in reports that were immediately classified at levels higher than even most military commanders could access. The technical challenge was in many ways the mirror image of harmonic defense. Instead of structures designed to dissipate blast energy, they were designing explosive charges that would generate highly specific frequency profiles calculated to trigger destructive resonance in reinforced concrete structures. The mathematics was brutally complex. They had to account for the specific composition and geometry of German fortifications, calculate the resonance characteristics of those structures, and design explosive charges that could generate the precise frequency signatures needed to cause catastrophic failure. The first successful test came in August 1944 at a remote testing facility in Scotland where the British had constructed a replica of a German coastal bunker. The structure was a massive concrete box, walls 2 meters thick, designed to the same specifications as German fortifications in France. Conventional explosives had proven largely ineffective against such structures. You could damage them with sustained bombardment, but destroying them quickly required enormous quantities of high explosives. William's harmonic demolition charge was different. It was a specially designed explosive device weighing only about 50 kilograms, far smaller than conventional bunker-busting weapons. But the charge incorporated multiple explosive elements that detonated in a carefully choreographed sequence, generating a complex pressure wave that matched the calculated resonance frequency of the bunker structure. When the charge detonated, the effect was spectacular and terrifying. The massive concrete structure didn't just explode, it seemed to tear itself apart from within, the walls cracking and collapsing as the structure vibrated at its resonance frequency. Within seconds, the supposedly invincible bunker was reduced to rubble. The demolition was so effective that even William, who had designed the weapon, was shaken by witnessing its destructive power. "My God," Dr. Fisher murmured, watching the destruction. "We've created something genuinely terrible. We've also created something that will save Allied lives during the invasion," one of the Royal Engineers officers reminded them. "Every German bunker we can neutralize this quickly is a position that won't be firing on our soldiers." William said nothing, watching the dust settle over the ruins of the test bunker, thinking about the implications of what they'd created. The technology would work, that was now proven. The question was what would happen with it, how it would be used, and what precedents they were setting for the future. In fact, harmonic demolition charges were used during and after D-Day, though far less extensively than the developers had anticipated. The technical requirements for using the weapons were demanding. You needed accurate intelligence about the target structure's composition and geometry, you needed to position the charges precisely, and you needed trained specialists who understood the principles well enough to make real-time adjustments. In the chaos of combat, these requirements were often impossible to meet. But there were several documented cases where harmonic charges successfully destroyed German fortifications that had resisted conventional attacks. One particular incident in Normandy involved a German bunker complex that had stopped an Allied advance for 2 days, its artillery position dominating a crucial road junction. A team of Royal Engineers, trained in harmonic demolition techniques, managed to infiltrate close to the position during darkness and place specially designed charges. The subsequent detonation destroyed the entire bunker complex in less than a minute, allowing the Allied advance to continue. William received reports of these successes with profoundly mixed emotions. Lives had been saved on the Allied side. That was undeniable. But he'd also created a weapon that had killed German soldiers who probably never knew what killed them, who died because William's calculations had identified precise ways to exploit the structural properties of their fortifications. The full extent of Project Resonance Echo remained classified throughout the war and for decades afterward. The weapons developed were used rarely and carefully, primarily because military commanders didn't fully trust or understand the technology. After the war ended, most of the specialized harmonic demolition charges were destroyed, and the detailed technical specifications were locked away in classified archives. But the knowledge couldn't be locked away forever. By the 1960s, as the Cold War intensified, both American and Soviet scientists were independently developing similar concepts for using harmonic resonance in demolition and weapons applications. William, who remained a consultant to British and American defense agencies, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being asked to help develop countermeasures against weapons that were essentially descendants of his own wartime work. In 1967, at age 65 and approaching retirement, William was invited to give a classified briefing to a joint committee of American and British defense officials about the history and implications of harmonic weapons technology. It was the first time he'd been asked to publicly discuss Project Resonance Echo, even in a classified setting, and he used the opportunity to share not just the technical history but also his personal reflections on the ethical dimensions of the work. When I was asked in 1944 to weaponize harmonic principles, William began his presentation. I struggled with the decision. I ultimately agreed because I believed the Allied cause was just and because I feared that refusing would only mean someone less careful would do the work. But I want to be clear. Every life taken by weapons derived from my research weighs on me. I don't claim those deaths were necessary or justified or anything other than what they were, deliberate applications of my knowledge to cause destruction. He paused, looking at the assembled officials. The reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to understand something that took me years to accept. Innovation, particularly in defense and military technology, is never morally neutral. Every advance creates new capabilities that can be used for both protection and destruction. The question isn't whether to pursue innovation. In a world where others are constantly advancing, standing still is not a viable option. The question is how to pursue innovation responsibly, with clear moral guardrails, with mechanisms to prevent misuse, and with honest acknowledgement of the costs. One of the American officials, a Pentagon analyst, asked, "Dr. Harrison, knowing what you know now, would you make the same choices? Would you still develop harmonic weapons if asked today?" William considered the question carefully. I honestly don't know. The consequences of my choices, both the defensive work that saved lives and the offensive work that took lives, extended far beyond what I could predict or control. Some of those consequences were positive, some negative, many ambiguous. What I can say is that if I were to face similar choices today, I would insist on more robust ethical oversight, more constraints on how the technology could be used, and more aggressive parallel development of defensive countermeasures. After the briefing, William was approached by a young engineer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a man named Captain James Morrison who had been studying William's work as part of his military education. Morrison asked William a question that cut to the heart of the dilemma. "Sir, you're famous for developing harmonic defense architecture that saved thousands of lives during the Blitz. But you also developed harmonic weapons that killed people. How do you reconcile those two aspects of your legacy?" William thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't reconcile them, Captain. I hold both truths simultaneously. I created defensive systems that protected people, and I created weapons that killed people. Both came from the same fundamental knowledge about how structures respond to energy. The knowledge itself is neutral. It's a description of physical reality. But how that knowledge gets applied is a moral choice, and I made choices both to protect and to destroy. I live with both." "Does that keep you up at night?" Morrison asked quietly. "Every night," William admitted. "But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the people who develop powerful technologies should carry the weight of that responsibility, should feel the burden of what their creations enable. The alternative, treating engineering as purely technical work divorced from moral consequences, seems far more dangerous to me." In the final years of his life, William became an advocate for what would later be called values in design, or ethical engineering, the principle that engineers had responsibilities beyond technical excellence to consider the broader implications of their work. He gave lectures at universities, mentored young engineers, and wrote extensively about the ethical dimensions of technological innovation. His final major work, published in 1967, was a memoir titled Resonance and Responsibility: Reflections on Engineering in Wartime. The book was remarkable for its honesty about both William's achievements and his moral struggles. He wrote openly about the decision to weaponize harmonic principles, about the German soldiers killed by weapons he designed, about his ongoing uncertainty about whether those choices had been right. "I was called upon to innovate during desperate times," William wrote in the book's conclusion, "and I did so to the best of my ability. Some of that innovation saved lives, some took lives, and much had consequences I never anticipated and couldn't control. I don't offer my story as a model to emulate or a cautionary tale to avoid. I offer it as an honest account of what it means to be an engineer working on problems that matter, where the stakes are measured in human lives and where perfect moral clarity is a luxury that circumstances don't permit. If there's a lesson in my experience," he continued, "it's that we must remain humble about our ability to predict or control the consequences of our innovations. We must build in safeguards, develop defensive countermeasures alongside offensive capabilities, and never lose sight of the human beings affected by our technical decisions. And we must be willing to carry the weight of responsibility for what we create, acknowledging both the benefits and the harms that flow from our work." William Harrison died in 1969, at age 67, from complications following a stroke. His funeral was attended by hundreds, fellow engineers, former government officials, students he had mentored, and several elderly men and women who had worked in HDA-protected facilities during the Blitz and credited those structures with saving their lives. Among the attendees was James Morrison, the young Army engineer who had questioned William about reconciling his dual legacy. Morrison, who would go on to become a prominent engineer himself and an advocate for ethical engineering education, delivered a eulogy that captured William's complex legacy. "William Harrison was a man who changed the world through innovation," Morrison said. "But he was also a man who never stopped questioning whether those changes were for the better. He saved thousands of lives with his defensive designs, and he took lives with his offensive weapons, and he carried the weight of both for his entire life. He didn't offer easy answers or comfortable certainties. He offered honest struggle with difficult questions. In an age where technology seems to advance without moral guardrails," Morrison continued, "where innovation races ahead of our ability to understand its consequences, William Harrison's example is more relevant than ever. He showed us that great engineers must also be moral philosophers, that technical brilliance without ethical reflection is dangerous, and that the proper response to the awesome power of modern technology is not pride but humility, not certainty but careful deliberation." The papers found in William's study after his death included hundreds of pages of calculations, designs, and technical notes, but also journals where he had documented his moral reasoning, his doubts, his attempts to justify or question his choices. These personal documents, donated to the Imperial War Museum by Margaret Harrison after her own death in 1981, provided unprecedented insight into the inner life of an engineer grappling with the consequences of innovation. One journal entry, dated June 1944, shortly after D-Day, captured William's state of mind. Today I received confirmation that harmonic charges were used successfully against German fortifications in Normandy. Allied casualties were reduced because positions that would have required sustained assault were neutralized quickly. I should feel satisfaction. My work achieved its intended purpose, saved Allied lives. Instead I feel hollow. I created those weapons. I designed them specifically to exploit structural vulnerabilities in ways that would cause catastrophic failure. German soldiers died because of calculations I made, frequencies I specified, design choices I validated. Their deaths were not incidental to my work, they were the intended outcome. How does one live with that? How does one claim credit for the lives saved without accepting responsibility for the lives taken? I don't have answers, only the certainty that I cannot separate one from the other, cannot claim the moral high ground while standing on a foundation built partly from destruction I enabled. These honest reflections made William Harrison's legacy more complex but also more enduring than if he had simply been celebrated as a wartime hero or condemned as a weapons developer. He was both and neither, an innovator who saved lives and took lives, who developed defensive systems and offensive weapons, who achieved remarkable technical breakthroughs while never losing sight of their human costs. The Thames Industrial Complex, where William had first conceived of harmonic defense architecture while watching Ju-88 bombers overhead, continued operating until the 1990s. When it was finally decommissioned and converted to mixed commercial use, preservationists successfully argued for maintaining the original test section as a historical landmark. Today, visitors can tour that test section, see the unusual structural elements that William designed, and read displays explaining how one engineer's crazy idea during the Blitz had led to innovations that influenced architecture, seismology, acoustic engineering, and even weapons design. But the most moving display is perhaps the simplest: a photograph of William Harrison standing on the steel framework of the complex in September 1940, the day he first observed the harmonic resonance that would inspire his life's work. He's looking up at the sky, where contrails mark the passage of German bombers, his expression captured in that moment before inspiration, before the years of work and moral struggle, before the lives saved and the lives taken, before the complex legacy that would define not just his career but his entire sense of who he was and what his innovations meant. That photograph, with its mixture of danger and possibility, of threat and response, of innovation born from desperate necessity, serves as a reminder that the story of how an engineer's crazy idea helped England withstand the Ju-88's bombing during the Blitz is also a story about moral complexity, about the dual-use nature of knowledge, about the impossible choices that war forces upon people trying to do the right thing in circumstances where there are no purely right answers. William Harrison's legacy is not just the buildings that protected people or the weapons that destroyed fortifications. It's the honest struggle with the moral weight of innovation, the acknowledgement that great technical achievements come with great moral responsibilities, and the recognition that sometimes saving lives and taking lives are two inseparable aspects of the same human endeavor.